In a town where reputation was worth more than money, Ilara lost hers in a single night. Cast out by her own father, abandoned by the man who swore he loved her, she found herself shivering beside the pigsty, pregnant, hungry, and branded a disgrace by an entire community. But as winter tightened its grip, something far more dangerous than the cold began to stir. Whispers, secrets, a century-old lie buried beneath the snow, powerful enough to destroy fortunes and expose the rot behind the town's most revered family. And when a mysterious, wealthy newcomer quietly left firewood at her door, it became clear Ilara's fall was only the beginning. Her story was about to crack open the truth everyone feared. In a town where a good name was the only currency that truly mattered, Ilara was about to be declared bankrupt. The cold autumn wind whipped around the corners of the farmhouse, a mournful sound that seemed to carry the whispers of the entire community, whispers that had, in a matter of days, turned her from a beloved daughter into a walking disgrace. The heavy oak door of her family home, a door she had run through 1,000 times with skinned knees and laughter, was now a fortress wall she could not breach. On the other side was everything she had ever known: warmth, safety, family. On her side, there was only the biting cold and the foul. Thick stench of the pigsty, her father's face, etched with a fury born of shame, was the last thing she had seen. His words echoed in her ears, colder than the wind itself. "You have brought sin into this house. You will not tarnish our name with your filth." He was a man who measured his worth in the silent, approving nods of his neighbors at Sunday service, a man whose entire legacy was built on a foundation of unblemished honor. An unmarried, pregnant daughter was a crack in that foundation so deep he believed it would bring the whole structure crashing down. He had given her a choice, an impossible one: give up the child, send it away where it could never cast its shadow on their family, or be cast out herself. For Ilara, her hand resting protectively on the slight curve of her belly, it wasn't a choice at all. This tiny, fluttering life was the only thing in the world that was truly hers. And she would not abandon it. Her refusal had sealed her fate. He hadn't just thrown her out, he had banished her to the most wretched corner of their property. The shed was a forgotten structure of rotting planks and rusted tin, leaning precariously against the fence of the pig pen. It was where broken tools and old feed sacks went to decay. Now, it was to be her home. The finality of it all sank in as she heard the heavy thud of the bolt sliding into place on the farmhouse door. A sound that severed her past from her future, her first desperate goal formed in the fog of her shock, a primal instinct taking over. She had to survive the coming winter, for herself and for the innocent life she carried. It had all started with a promise, a whisper in the dark that felt as real and solid as the ground beneath her feet. Caleb, with his easy smile and a standing in the community as golden as his family's vast fortune, had sworn he would stand by her. He was from one of the town's most prominent families, a clan whose wealth and influence were woven into the very fabric of the community. He had asked for just a few days, time to speak to his parents, to smooth things over. Ilara, clinging to that fragile hope, had agreed. She spent those days in a state of suspended animation, a knot of anxiety and anticipation tightening in her chest with every passing hour. This unraveling was swift and brutal. The news broke not from Caleb, but from the venomous gossip that spread through the town like wildfire. He had gone to his family, but not to defend her. He went to save himself. He stood before the town's unofficial court of public opinion and denied everything. He painted her as reckless, as someone who couldn't be trusted, skillfully shifting the blame until her name was synonymous with shame. The same neighbors who had watched her grow up, who had praised her gentle nature, now averted their eyes when she passed on the street. Their doors closed quietly as she approached. The betrayal from Caleb was a sharp, deep wound, but the shunning from her own community, the people she had known her entire life, was a slow, suffocating poison. Now, shivering in the dilapidated shed, she understood the true power of their judgment. It was a weapon far more effective than any physical blow. It could strip you of your identity, your support, your very humanity, leaving you utterly alone. The pigs grunted and shuffled in the mud just a few feet away, their warmth and life a stark contrast to the chilling isolation that enveloped her. She ran a hand over the rough, splintered wood of the wall, the cold seeping into her bones. This wasn't just a shelter, it was a cage. A public display of her disgrace, placed right where her father could see it every day, a constant, bitter reminder of the honor he was so desperate to protect. As the first delicate snowflakes of the season began to drift down from a bruised, gray sky, Ilara wrapped her thin arms around herself, a silent vow forming in her heart. They could take her home, they could take her name, but they would not break her. The vow was a spark in the overwhelming dark, but a spark could not provide warmth. The days that followed blurred into a monotonous cycle of shivering and hunger. Winter did not arrive gently. It descended upon the small town like a judgment, burying the fields under a thick blanket of white and sealing Ilara in her frigid prison. The wind found every crack in the shed's rotting planks, whistling a constant, mournful tune that seeped into her bones. Her world shrank to the four splintered walls, the damp straw she used for a bed, and the ever-present sour smell of the pigsty. She rationed the few scraps of food her mother had managed to smuggle out before the finality of the bolted door, but they were gone within days. Hunger became a dull, constant ache, a hollow companion in her solitude. Her only view of the outside world was through a grimy, cracked pane of glass that looked out over the fence towards the adjacent property. It was the old Miller farm, a place that had been neglected for decades until a mysterious buyer had acquired it a few months back. Lights now glowed in the windows of the main house, a stark contrast to the darkness that had shrouded it for so long. The town whispered about the new owner, a wealthy recluse named Arthur Vance. No one knew where his fortune came from. Some said he'd made a killing in technology stocks. Others whispered about a massive inheritance, a family capital so vast it defied imagination. He was a ghost, a man who had bought the land but seemed to want nothing to do with the community. Ilara would sometimes see him, a tall, solitary figure walking the snow-covered fields, his shoulders hunched against the wind as if carrying an immense weight. He never looked her way, and she, in her shame, made sure to stay hidden whenever he was near. One morning, the cold was so severe that she could no longer feel her fingers or toes. Despair was beginning to set in, a chilling fog that threatened to extinguish the small spark of her vow. She pushed open the shed door, squinting against the bright, unforgiving glare of the sun on the snow, and stopped dead. There, neatly stacked against the wall, was a small pile of dry, split firewood, and resting on top was a thick woolen blanket, its deep blue color a shock of life against the monochrome landscape. She looked around wildly, her heart pounding. The snow was undisturbed, save for a single set of large footprints leading back towards the Vance property. He had seen her. The thought sent a jolt of fear and shame through her, but it was quickly replaced by a wave of overwhelming gratitude. It was an act of silent charity, an acknowledgement that she existed. That night, for the first time in weeks, Ilara was warm. A small, carefully tended fire crackled in a makeshift hearth of stones, and wrapped in the thick blanket, she felt a flicker of something she had thought was lost forever: hope. The small measure of warmth gave her strength. She began to truly examine her surroundings, desperate to find anything that could help her survive. In a dark, cobweb-filled corner of the shed, half buried under a pile of empty burlap sacks, was a small, wooden chest, its hinges rusted shut. It took all her strength to pry it open. Inside, nestled amongst moth-eaten linens, was a leather-bound journal. The leather was cracked with age, but the name embossed on the cover was still legible. Annalise, her grandmother. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. She had barely known the woman, who had passed when she was just a small child. But the stories of her connection to the land were legendary. They said she could heal any ailment with the plants that grew in the fields and forests. With trembling fingers, Ilara opened the book. The pages were filled with her grandmother's elegant, looping script and detailed, hand-drawn sketches of plants, roots and flowers. Beside each drawing were notes on their properties, their uses, and the proper way to prepare them. It was a treasure trove of forgotten wisdom, a legacy far more valuable than any amount of money or land. It was the knowledge of survival. She spent hours poring over the pages by the light of her small fire, her grandmother's voice seeming to whisper to her from the faded ink. She learned to identify the hardy winter weeds that clung to life beneath the snow, the barks that could be brewed into a nourishing tea, the roots that, when boiled, could quell the pangs of hunger. The next day, guided by the journal, she ventured out. She recognized the gnarled shape of a burdock root pushing through the snow near the fence line, just as her grandmother had sketched it. She dug it out with a shard of broken wood, her fingers raw and numb from the cold. Back in the shed, she washed it with melted snow and cooked it over the fire. It wasn't much, but as she ate the tough, earthy root, a profound sense of victory washed over her. This was not charity. This was not a scrap from someone else's table. This was hers. She had found it. She had prepared it, and it was sustaining her. It was the first harvest of her new solitary life, a testament to a resilience she was only just beginning to discover within herself. She was more than her father's daughter or Caleb's mistake. She was the granddaughter of Annalise, a woman of the earth, and that was an inheritance no one could ever take away from her. But that inheritance, rich in wisdom, could not buy food at the general store or pay for a doctor. It was a currency the world had forgotten how to value. Her small victories against the cold and hunger were hard won, but they were not enough. As the winter deepened, so did her isolation. It was during one particularly bleak afternoon, while she was scraping the last of a boiled root from a tin cup, that a figure appeared at the edge of the property, casting a long shadow across the snow. It was Caleb. He looked different, his usual easy confidence replaced by a strained, almost haunted look. He didn't approach the shed directly, but stood awkwardly by the fence, as if the stench of the pigsty might cling to his expensive wool coat. He cleared his throat, the sound swallowed by the vast, silent landscape. "Ilara," he said, his voice thin. I came to see if you were all right." The words felt hollow, a pathetic attempt at concern from the man who had orchestrated her ruin. She remained silent, watching him from the doorway of her hovel, her grandmother's journal clutched in her hands like a shield. He fumbled inside his coat and pulled out a thick envelope. "Look," he said, his voice gaining a desperate edge. "I know things have been hard. My father, he wants to help. There's money in here. Enough for you to go somewhere else. Start over. A new town where nobody knows you." He pushed the envelope through a gap in the fence, the white paper a stark blemish against the weathered grey wood. It was a business transaction, a payoff to erase an inconvenient truth. His family's vast fortune, built on generations of shrewd business and investment, was being used not to right a wrong, but to bury it. A cold, quiet fury rose in Ilara, a strength she didn't know she possessed. She looked at the envelope, then back at his face. "My child and I are not a problem to be paid off, Caleb." Her voice was steady, devoid of the tears he might have expected. "This is our home." His face hardened, the mask of concern slipping away to reveal raw anger. "Don't be a fool. What kind of life can you give a child here, in a pigsty? Take the money and go." He saw her resilience not as strength, but as a stubborn refusal to accept his family's capital as the ultimate solution. Her proud refusal was an insult to his power, to the very notion that a few $1,000s couldn't solve any problem. He snatched the envelope back. "Fine," he spat, his voice laced with venom. "Stay here and rot. But don't think for a second that anyone in this town will ever help you. My family made this town. We can unmake you." He turned and stalked away, his expensive boots crunching on the pristine snow, leaving behind a silence more menacing than his threats. His words were not an idle threat. In the weeks that followed, a new kind of chill settled over Ilara's existence. It was a systematic, calculated cruelty orchestrated by Caleb's family. The general store owner, who had once given her candy as a child, suddenly found his ledgers didn't allow for charity. The farmer who sometimes hired extra hands for mending fences suddenly had no work for her. Whispers followed her like shadows, each one a fresh lie painting her as unhinged and dangerous. Caleb's family was a financial dynasty in this small corner of the world. Their wealth was the town's lifeblood, and their displeasure was a death sentence. They were turning the entire community against her, ensuring that every door, literal and figurative, was slammed shut in her face. Her isolation was now complete, a wall built of whispers and fear, far more impenetrable than the bolted door of her father's house. It was in this suffocating solitude that a new sound broke the monotony, the panicked cries of animals. The sound came from Arthur Vance's property. Peeking through the crack in her shed, Ilara saw a scene of distress. Arthur and another man, clearly a veterinarian, were in the pasture with his herd of prized cattle, a significant part of his agricultural assets. Several of the animals were lying on the ground, breathing in shallow, ragged gasps, while others stumbled about, disoriented. Arthur's usual stoic calm was gone, replaced by a visible, raw anxiety. Ilara could overhear snippets of their conversation carried on the wind. "I've never seen anything like it," the vet said, shaking his head in defeat. "It's not bacterial, not viral. Their systems are just shutting down. I'm sorry, Arthur. I don't know what else to do." As the vet described the symptoms, the lethargy, the frothing at the mouth, the rapid decline, a flicker of recognition sparked in Ilara's mind. She scrambled back into the shed, her frozen fingers fumbling through the pages of her grandmother's journal. And there it was, a detailed drawing of a delicate white-flowered weed with a notation in the margin, "Nightshade's Kiss." Harmless to the touch, but fatal to livestock if ingested. Causes lethargy, confusion, and a swift, peaceful-seeming end. The root, however, when crushed and mixed with clay and charcoal, draws the poison out. She looked at the drawing, then back out the window. In a corner of Arthur's pasture, where the snow had melted back, she could see a patch of the very same white-flowered weed, blooming innocently in the winter sun. She knew what she had to do. It was a terrifying prospect. Approaching the reclusive man who was practically a legend, a man whose net worth was the subject of wild speculation. But the memory of the blanket and the firewood, of his silent act of kindness, gave her courage. Using the last of her strength, she dug up the specific roots her grandmother described, crushed them with a stone as instructed, and created a dark, earthy poultice. She didn't dare approach him directly. Instead, under the cover of twilight, she crept to the fence line, placed the poultice in a tin bowl with a hastily scribbled note of instruction, and left it where he would find it. It was a desperate gamble, a whisper of ancient knowledge against the certainty of modern failure. She slept fitfully, the gamble weighing on her mind, and awoke before dawn to a profound silence. The usual pained groans from the neighboring pasture were gone. Peeking through the crack in the wall, she saw Arthur Vance standing motionless in the middle of his field, his silhouette dark against the pale, rising sun. He wasn't looking at the sick animals. He was looking directly at her shed. A knot of fear tightened in her stomach. Had she made things worse? Had her primitive remedy poisoned his valuable livestock, destroying a significant portion of his assets? She watched as he took a slow, deliberate step towards her, then another. There was no anger in his stride, but something else she couldn't decipher, an intensity. He stopped at the fence line, his gaze fixed on her door. "I know you're in there," he called out, his voice deep and steady, carrying easily in the still morning air. "Please, come out." With trembling hands, Ilara pushed open the shed door. The cold air hit her face, but it was the sight in the pasture that took her breath away. The cattle, which had been on the verge of death just hours before, were standing. Some were already grazing, their movements weak but purposeful. The recovery was nothing short of miraculous. Arthur followed her gaze, a look of weary disbelief on his face. "How?" he asked, his voice softer now. "The vet, with all his modern medicine, gave up, but this old-world remedy." He held up the empty tin bowl. "It worked." "How did you know?" Ilara clutched her grandmother's journal to her chest. "It was my grandmother's," she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. "She knew the land. She wrote everything down." Arthur looked from the journal to Ilara's face, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw not the town pariah, but a young woman with eyes that held a wisdom far beyond her years, her face smudged with soot and thin from hunger, yet radiating an undeniable strength. He was a man who had built a fortune through shrewd investments and a keen understanding of complex systems, a multimillionaire who could move markets with a single phone call. But he was humbled by this simple, profound knowledge of the earth. "I owe you a debt I can't possibly repay," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "You saved a significant part of my investment in this place, but I'd like to try." He paused, his expression serious. "This is no place for you, or for your child. There is a small cottage on the far side of the property. It's empty, but it's warm and sound. I want you to live there, and I want to offer you a job, a real job, with a proper salary. Help me restore this farm. Your knowledge, it's more valuable than any capital I could invest. It's the missing piece." Tears welled in Ilara's eyes, hot against her cold cheeks. A home, a job, a chance. It was more than she had dared to dream of. It was a lifeline thrown into the abyss. She could only nod, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The move was a blur. Arthur helped her carry her few meager possessions, the woolen blanket, her grandmother's journal, the tin cup, from the foul-smelling shed to the small stone cottage. The moment she stepped inside, the warmth enveloped her like a hug. There was a real bed with clean sheets, a small kitchen with a working stove, and a fireplace with a roaring fire already lit. After weeks of shivering in the dark, the simple glow of a lamp on a table felt like the most profound luxury imaginable. It was a safe harbor, a place to heal. But her newfound safety only served to stoke the fires of the town's resentment. From her father's farmhouse, he watched the smoke curling from the cottage chimney, his face a mask of stone. His daughter, the source of his shame, was now living under the protection of the wealthy outsider, a public declaration of her defiance. The arrangement fueled the town's gossip to a fever pitch, twisting an act of gratitude into something sordid and scandalous. Caleb's family, seeing their attempt to crush her spirit fail so spectacularly, grew even more vindictive. Her survival was an affront to their power, a loose thread that could unravel the entire tapestry of lies they had so carefully woven. As the last of the snow melted and the first green shoots of spring pushed through the soil, a new routine settled in. Ilara worked alongside Arthur, her grandmother's journal always at her side. A quiet, respectful partnership formed between them. He had the resources and the business acumen. She had the innate wisdom of the land. They discovered a shared vision, not just for a profitable farm, but for a sustainable one. Using the old ways to nurture the soil back to health, they planned crop rotations, designed herb gardens, and spoke of the future. For the first time in a long time, Ilara felt a sense of purpose. She was building something, a legacy for her child. Their burgeoning success, however, did not go unnoticed. It became a target. One afternoon, as Ilara was tending to a patch of newly planted chamomile, a sleek, expensive car pulled up the long driveway. A man in a sharp suit stepped out, carrying a leather briefcase. He wasn't there to buy produce. He was a lawyer, and he handed Arthur a thick legal document. It was a formal notice of a lawsuit. Caleb's family, using their vast financial resources, had unearthed an ambiguous, century-old map. They were filing a claim asserting that a crucial portion of Arthur's property, the very heart of his farm, containing the main well and the most fertile pasture, rightfully belonged to them due to an old boundary dispute. Their motivation was brutally clear: to bleed him dry with legal fees, destroy his business, and drive both him and the woman he was protecting out of the community for good. The manufactured evidence was cleverly presented, legally sound on the surface, and it presented an obstacle that seemed utterly insurmountable. Arthur stared at the legal documents spread across his heavy oak desk. The crisp white pages, a stark violation in the rustic warmth of his home. For a man whose entire life had been defined by calculated risks, by understanding the intricate dance of the stock market and the abstract value of assets like Bitcoin and gold, this was a different kind of battle. This wasn't about numbers or market trends. It was about dirt, history, and malice. His vast fortune, a formidable shield in the world of high-stakes business, felt clumsy and ineffective against this kind of attack. He could liquidate millions of dollars in stocks with a single call, but he couldn't change the ink on a 100-year-old map, however fraudulent it might be. Ilara stood by the window, watching the spring landscape burst into life, a cruel contrast to the withering of her own hopes. A crushing weight of guilt settled upon her. This was her fault. She had brought this storm to Arthur's door. He had offered her sanctuary, and in return she had made him a target for the most powerful and ruthless family in the county. "I should go," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "If I'm not here, they'll have no reason to do this to you." Arthur looked up, his eyes meeting hers in the reflection on the window pane. "And where would you go?" he asked, his tone not accusatory, but genuinely concerned. "To let them win. Let them drive us both out with lies. No! This is no longer just about you, Ilara. They've challenged my ownership, my investment in this land. They've made it about business." He tapped a finger on the map. "And I have never, ever walked away from a fight that I know is just." Despite his words, the days that followed were a descent into a legal quagmire. Arthur's high-priced lawyers from the city, men accustomed to corporate mergers and intellectual property disputes, were baffled by the rural pettiness of the case. They spoke in terms of settlements and buyouts, suggesting that Arthur simply use his immense capital to purchase the disputed land from Caleb's family, even though he already owned it. It would be cheaper than the litigation, one of them had advised over the phone, his voice slick with pragmatism. But for Arthur, it was a matter of principle. His entire net worth was built on the idea of legitimate ownership and fair dealings. To pay off a fraudulent claim felt like a betrayal of his own code. They spent long nights in the farmhouse study, poring over old county records, deeds and surveys, searching for a flaw in the other family's claim. The air grew thick with the smell of old paper and fresh coffee. During these hours, the line between employer and employee blurred. They were partners in a desperate search for truth. Ilara, with her quiet, methodical nature, proved to be an invaluable researcher, her eyes scanning documents for inconsistencies that the lawyers had missed. She felt a strange sense of belonging in that room, a feeling that she was contributing something more than just her knowledge of herbs. She was defending her new home, her future, but the town had already passed its verdict. The lawsuit, was the talk of the general store, the post office, and the church steps. The narrative, carefully crafted by Caleb's family, was that the rich, arrogant outsider was trying to steal land from a family that had been there for generations. Ilara was cast as the manipulative woman at the center of it all, the serpent in the garden. The few friendly faces that had begun to emerge now turned away again. The isolation she had felt in the shed returned, colder and more profound than before, because now she had something precious to lose. Arthur saw the toll it was taking on her, the way her shoulders slumped and the light in her eyes dimmed. He saw her place a protective hand over her growing belly, a gesture that spoke of both fierce love and deep-seated fear. He found his own resolve hardening, not just for the sake of his property, but for her. He would not let them break her spirit again. He would pour whatever resources were necessary into this fight, even if it meant a significant hit to his portfolio of assets, because some things were more valuable than money. The battle lines were drawn not in the dirt of the disputed pasture, but in courtrooms and law offices miles away. Arthur, a man accustomed to the swift, decisive nature of the stock market, found himself mired in the slow, grinding machinery of the law. His lawyers, sharp and expensive, spoke of motions, depositions, and continuances. Each action was a drain on his liquid capital, a steady hemorrhage of the fortune he had so carefully built. The euros and dollars in his accounts, which once represented freedom and power, were now just ammunition for a war he never wanted to fight. He'd spend hours on the phone, the frustration evident in his voice as he tried to explain the principle of the matter to men who only understood the cost. This wasn't a hostile takeover or a bad investment. It was a personal vendetta disguised as a legal dispute, and it was costing him dearly. Back at the farmhouse, a different kind of battle was being waged. Ilara's younger brother, Liam, sat at the long family dinner table, the silence between him, his father, and his mother as heavy as the uneaten food on their plates. Liam had always been the quiet one, an observer. He saw the grim satisfaction in his father's eyes every time a new legal bill arrived for Arthur Vance, and he saw the deep, unspoken misery etched on his mother's face. He was trapped between them, suffocated by a loyalty he no longer felt was righteous. His father spoke of honor, but Liam saw only cruelty. He spoke of protecting the family name, but Liam saw him conspiring with the very family that had destroyed his sisters. The hypocrisy was a bitter taste in his mouth, worse than any food he was served. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon. Liam was at the hardware store when his father walked in with Caleb's father, the patriarch of the clan tormenting Ilara. They were laughing, their voices booming with the confidence of men who had never known defeat. They didn't see Liam in the back aisle. That old survey map was a stroke of genius, Caleb's father bragged, clapping Liam's father on the back. Our great-grandfathers must be rolling in their graves, Liam's father chuckled, a low, ugly sound. They made their deals in good faith. It's not our fault the Vances let their own history get buried. A few more weeks of legal fees, and that city millionaire will be begging to sell us the whole property for pennies on the dollar. The casual cruelty of it, the open admission of their scheme, sent a shockwave through Liam. This wasn't just a dispute, it was a calculated act of fraud designed to ruin an innocent man and further punish his own sister. That night, Liam couldn't sleep. The conversation echoed in his mind, mingling with memories of Ilara's laughter before it had all been stolen from her. He thought of the stories his grandmother used to tell about their great-grandfather, a man she described as stern but scrupulously honest. It didn't add up. Driven by a desperate need for the truth, he crept up to the dusty, forgotten attic, a place filled with the ghosts of his family's past. He ran his flashlight over old furniture draped in white sheets, stacks of yellowed newspapers, and leather trunks bound with rusted brass. In the far corner sat his great-grandfather's old roll-top desk, A piece of furniture no one had touched in 50 years. He pulled at the handle, but it was locked tight. A surge of adrenaline hit him. With a piece of scrap metal from a broken lantern, he worked at the lock, his heart pounding with each scrape and click. Finally, with a loud crack, the lock gave way. He rolled back the top of the desk, revealing a series of dusty cubby holes filled with dried-up inkwells and brittle papers. It seemed like a dead end. Disappointment washed over him. As he was about to close it, his fingers brushed against the bottom of the main compartment. The wood felt loose. He pressed down, and a section of the floor popped up, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. His breath caught in his throat. Lying inside was a single, thick envelope, sealed with dark red wax bearing his family's crest. The paper was yellow with age, and the ink on the front, written in his great-grandfather's elegant hand, was faded but clear. It was addressed not to anyone in particular, but with a simple, chilling instruction, to be opened in the event of a dispute over the northern pasture. With trembling hands, Liam broke the seal. Inside was a folded, handwritten letter and a second, official-looking deed, its paper crisp and its ink still dark. He unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning the first few lines. To whatever descendant of mine reads this, I write to confess a truth I was too cowardly to speak in life. A great injustice was done concerning the boundary line with the Vance property, an injustice I was forced to witness in silence. Liam's blood ran cold. He wasn't just holding a letter, he was holding a confession, a time bomb that had been ticking silently in the heart of his family home for nearly a century. He read on, the spidery script a voice from the grave, detailing a story of greed and coercion. His great-grandfather wrote of how the Vance family, generations ago, had been the original settlers of that land, their title clear, but Caleb's ancestors, through a series of ruthless business dealings and intimidation, had driven them away. The final act was a fraudulent survey, conducted by a man in their debt, which illegally redrew the property lines. His own great-grandfather, a young man at the time and financially dependent on Caleb's family for his own farm's survival, was threatened into silence. He had witnessed the fraud, signed as a witness under duress, and lived with the shame for the rest of his life. The letter was his only attempt at redemption, a desperate hope that a future descendant would have the courage he lacked. The second document was the original true deed, hidden away as proof of the crime. Liam sat back on his heels in the dusty attic, the weight of a century of silence pressing down on him. This wasn't just about Ilara anymore. It was about a historical theft, a legacy of deceit that his own family had been complicit in upholding. His father wasn't just protecting their name, he was perpetuating a lie that had enriched their neighbors and built a local dynasty on a rotten foundation. The vast fortune of Caleb's family, their immense capital and their portfolio of assets, was seeded with this original sin. He thought of Arthur Vance, a man trying to reclaim a piece of his own lost history, being bled dry in legal fees. His investment turning into a liability because of this ancient crime. And he thought of Ilara, her belly now round with new life, fighting for a foothold in a world that had tried to erase her. The decision settled in his heart, not with a crash, but with a quiet, solemn clarity. Fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach at the thought of defying his father, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, protective love for his sister and an undeniable call for justice. He carefully folded the letter and the deed, placed them back in the envelope, and tucked it inside his jacket. He was no longer just an observer. He was now the keeper of the truth, and he knew what he had to do. The climax was set for a tense town hall meeting. A formal proceeding convened to settle the dispute once and for all. The room was packed, the air thick with anticipation and simmering resentment. On one side sat Caleb's family, a united front of smug confidence, their expensive lawyer shuffling papers with an air of inevitable victory. On the other sat Arthur and Ilara, Arthur's face was a stoic mask, but Ilara could see the tension in his jaw. His lawyers had told him the manufactured evidence was legally tight. Their chances were slim. He was prepared to lose a significant portion of his net worth, all for an act of kindness. Ilara sat beside him, her hand resting on her unborn child. A silent promise that she would not break, no matter the outcome. Her father sat with the opposing family, his presence a public endorsement of their claim and a final, brutal rejection of his own daughter. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense man named Peterson, reviewed the final documents. Based on the historical survey map presented as evidence, he began, his voice echoing in the hushed hall, and the testimony provided. The court is inclined to rule in favor of the plaintiff. A wave of triumphant murmurs rippled through Caleb's family. Ilara's heart sank, the last flicker of hope threatening to be extinguished. Arthur placed a reassuring hand on her arm, a gesture of solidarity in defeat. Just as the judge was about to strike his gavel, the heavy double doors at the back of the hall creaked open with a dramatic groan. Every head turned. Framed in the doorway stood Liam, his face pale, but his eyes burning with resolve. He clutched a yellowed envelope in his hand, like a weapon. A collective gasp went through the room. His father's face went from smug satisfaction to ashen horror in a single, sickening moment. He knew what that envelope could contain. Liam strode down the central aisle, his footsteps the only sound in the cavernous space. He didn't look at his father, his mother, or even his sister. His eyes were fixed on Judge Peterson. He stopped before the judge's bench, his breathing steady despite the frantic pounding of his heart. "Your Honor," he said, his voice clear and strong, ringing with a conviction no one in that room had ever heard from him before. "Before you make your ruling, there is evidence you need to see, evidence that will prove this entire claim is built on a 100-year-old lie." Judge Peterson, a man not easily rattled, stared down from his bench. His gavel held motionless in midair. He lowered his hand slowly, his eyes narrowing on the young man before him. "That is a very serious accusation, son. You'd better have more than just words to back it up." Liam's hand did not shake as he placed the aged envelope on the polished wood of the judge's bench. "I have this, Your Honor, a confession from my great-grandfather, and the original deed he hid away." A collective, sharp intake of breath swept through the hall. Caleb's father shot to his feet, his face purple with rage. "This is an outrage, a fabrication. This boy is disturbed, trying to protect his disgraced sister." But his protest was drowned out by the sight of Ilara's father. The man, who had sat so proudly beside the town's most powerful family, seemed to shrink into himself. All the color drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, slack-jawed mask of terror. The carefully constructed walls of his honor, built over a lifetime of rigid piety, crumbled in an instant. He made a choked, gasping sound and slumped forward in his chair, his head in his hands, a broken man. Judge Peterson ignored the outburst. He carefully broke the brittle wax seal and unfolded the letter. His brow furrowed in concentration as his eyes scanned the faded script. The silence in the room was absolute, so profound that the rustle of the century-old paper sounded like a roar. He read for what felt like an eternity, his expression shifting from skepticism to shock, and finally to a cold, hard anger. He looked up, his gaze sweeping over the faces of Caleb's family, lingering for a moment on the patriarch. "This letter," the judge said, his voice low and dangerous, "is a sworn statement from this boy's great-grandfather. It details how your ancestor, through threats and financial coercion, forced him to witness a fraudulent land survey. It speaks of a crime committed not just against the Vance family, who were driven from their rightful property, but against the very integrity of this community." He then held up the second document. "And this," he announced, his voice booming now, appears to be the original legally filed deed to the property in question, predating your own claim by 20 years. A title that proves Arthur Vance is not just the current owner, but the heir to the land his family was cheated out of generations ago. The revelation landed like a physical blow. The smug confidence on the faces of Caleb's family dissolved into raw panic. Their carefully constructed legal attack, funded by their immense family fortune, had not just failed. It had unearthed a foundational crime that threatened to destroy their entire legacy. The wealth they had flaunted, the capital that gave them power, was suddenly tainted, revealed to be the fruit of a poisonous tree. The whispers started then, spreading through the crowd like a contagion. Decades of resentment towards the family's arrogance and iron-fisted control over the town's economy finally found a voice. People looked at them not with deference, but with contempt. Their social standing, an asset more valuable than any of their stocks or bonds, had just been rendered worthless. Judge Peterson struck his gavel, the sound cracking through the tense air like a gunshot. The claim brought by the plaintiff is dismissed with extreme prejudice, he declared. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office. Fraud, conspiracy, and perjury are serious crimes. The assets of your family may be subject to investigation. In the ensuing chaos, as Caleb's family was surrounded by stunned faces and accusatory glares, another, quieter drama was unfolding. Ilara's mother, a woman who had been a silent, stoic presence for months, slowly rose to her feet. She looked at her husband, still slumped in his chair, a pathetic figure stripped of his authority and honor. For years, she had submitted to his will, believing it was her duty. But seeing the truth of his cruelty laid bare, seeing the strength in her son and the resilience in her daughter, something inside her finally broke free. She turned her back on her husband without a word. Her gaze found Ilara across the crowded room. With quiet dignity, she walked down the aisle, her steps steady and sure. She walked past the shocked faces of her neighbors, past the disgrace of the family she had once been forced to respect, and stopped in front of her daughter. Tears streamed down her face, but her eyes were clear and strong. She reached out and took Ilara's hand, her touch a balm on a lifetime of wounds. My daughter," she whispered, her voice filled with a strength Ilara had never heard before. "I am so sorry. I should have stood with you. I am with you now." Ilara, who had faced every trial with stoic resolve, finally broke. Sobs of relief, of grief, of overwhelming love shook her body. She fell into her mother's embrace, the two women clinging to each other, a broken family starting to piece itself back together in the wreckage of lies. Arthur stood beside them, a silent guardian, his own eyes misty. He had come to this town seeking solitude to nurse his own grief, but had found himself at the center of a battle for justice. And in winning back his land, he had helped a family reclaim something far more precious, their truth. The town hall, once a place of judgment, had become a sanctuary of redemption. The days that followed were quiet, filled with a gentle, healing stillness. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape irrevocably changed. Caleb's family, facing a district attorney's investigation and the complete collapse of their social standing, retreated from public life. Their vast fortune, once a source of immense power, now felt like a gilded cage, trapping them in their shame. Ilara's father was a ghost in his own home, a man hollowed out by his own cruelty, but Ilara found she had no room in her heart for vengeance. Her world was now focused on the small stone cottage, on the warmth of her mother's presence, and the steady, reassuring beat of the new life growing within her. Her mother, freed from a lifetime of silent submission, blossomed. She and Ilara spent hours in the kitchen, recreating old family recipes, their laughter filling the small space. Liam was a constant presence, his quiet guilt replaced by a calm sense of pride. They were a fractured family, slowly, carefully, piecing themselves back together. As spring deepened into the lush promise of summer, the farm thrived. Under Ilara's guidance and Arthur's diligent work, the soil grew rich and dark, and the fields came alive with rows of herbs and vegetables. The partnership between them was one of unspoken understanding and deep mutual respect. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance, Arthur finally shared the piece of his past he had held so close. "This wasn't just a random investment for me, Ilara," he said, his voice soft. "This farm, it was my family's. My great-grandfather built that farmhouse. They lost it during a difficult time, generations ago. After my wife and son passed away, I felt unmoored. I had accumulated a great deal of wealth, a portfolio of assets and stocks that felt meaningless. I wanted to reclaim a piece of my own history, something real to hold on to." The confession hung in the air, a profound revelation that recontextualized everything. He wasn't just a wealthy benefactor, he was a man trying to heal his own shattered legacy, just as she was. He had been fighting for his own home all along. A few days later, Arthur came to the cottage, an uncharacteristic excitement in his eyes. He was holding her grandmother's journal and a series of printouts from his computer. "Ilara," he began, spreading the papers on the kitchen table, "I've been doing some research. The weeds your grandmother wrote about, the ones you use for your remedies, they aren't just weeds." He pointed to a page in the journal, then to a corresponding scientific article on his printout. "This one, the nightshade's kiss, you used for my cattle. It's a rare variety of Atropa belladonna used in very specific pharmaceutical applications. This other one," he pointed again, "oh, it is a type of wild ginseng that botanists thought was extinct in this region. Your grandmother wasn't just a folk healer, Ilara. She was a master botanist. The plants growing wild on this property, they're a gold mine. Not in the sense of gold bars or cryptocurrency, but in real, tangible value to the medicinal and organic markets." He looked at her, his expression serious and full of respect. "I want to build a business with you. Not for you, with you. An equal partnership, my capital, your knowledge. We'll cultivate these plants, create a brand based on your grandmother's legacy. This farm won't just be a place to live. It will be our enterprise, a legacy for your child, built on the wisdom that's in your blood." It was not a proposal of marriage or a gesture of charity. It was a business proposition between equals, an acknowledgement that her inheritance, the faded journal and the connection to the land, was an asset more valuable than any of the stocks or bonds in his vast portfolio. It was the ultimate validation of who she was. Summer arrived in a blaze of green and gold. In the small cottage, surrounded by her mother and brother, Ilara gave birth to a healthy baby girl. The story ends not in a church or a courtroom, but in a field bathed in the warm light of a late afternoon sun. Ilara stood on a hill overlooking the farm, her baby sleeping peacefully in her arms. The fields below were a tapestry of green, a testament to months of hard work and rediscovered wisdom. Arthur stood beside her, not as a savior, but as a partner, his gaze fixed on the thriving land they were building together. She was no longer the outcast in the pigsty, shivering in the cold. She was the co-owner of a flourishing enterprise, a mother, a daughter, a sister, and the keeper of a powerful legacy. The cruel winter was a distant memory. Here, in the warmth of the sun, surrounded by the fruits of her own resilience, she had finally reaped her harvest. If this story of resilience and redemption touched your heart, please show your support by liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to the channel for more inspiring stories. Thank you for watching.